So hello everyone, I'm Anthony, and today I'm going to present my Keystone and Master's Thesis project titled Partying the Pandemic, the Effects of Partisan Biases on Evaluations of President Trump's Response to COVID-19. And so to start off, I do need to issue a content warning. As we're all aware, the virus and pandemic has hurt millions of people, and many of us personally. And actually doing this research was depressing in and of itself. So I'll be discussing some effects of the virus, including death at length for this presentation, so feel free to virtually step out whenever you need. With that in mind, I'll try to start off with something light. So I want you guys to imagine something. Think of your political worldview as interpreting information with these 3D glasses pictured here. A strong conservative sees the world tinted in red with their left eye closed. A strong liberal sees in blue with their right eye closed. Looking at the same piece of information, despite the objective truth remaining the same, these two people will interpret this information very differently, however it best matches their political tint. This phenomenon is what scholars in my discipline refer to as partisan bias. So here are some objective facts for these partisans to interpret. To date, the US has seen 31 million COVID infections, 560,000 deaths, and a peak unemployment rate of 14.8%, a figure comparable only to the Great Depression of the 1930s. Every citizen in the US, as is the case for citizens all across the world, have in one way or another been forced to face the crippling reality of the pandemic. In the face of such an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, it makes sense to assume that we would hold our political leaders accountable for the results of their actions or inaction towards combating the spread of COVID. In the US, this responsibility had landed primarily on the shoulders of our previous commander-in-chief, President Donald Trump, and now President Joe Biden is also shouldering that burden. But this conventional wisdom regarding political accountability doesn't paint a full picture. Think back to our 3D glasses exercise, where blue lenses see these 560,000 deaths and extraordinary unemployment numbers as some horrible failing of the Trump administration. Red lenses see this as President Trump did his best, now it's all Biden's fault. But what if the stakes were raised? What if respondents weren't asked about the deaths of 560,000 strangers, about the job losses of somebody they never knew? What if instead they were asked about the death of their mother or their friend? What if they were asked about the loss of their own job? Would this be enough to maybe, just maybe, open both of their eyes for once? In this project, I sought to answer one simple question. How do partisan biases influence Americans' evaluations of Trump and Biden's handling of the pandemic response, factoring in how they have been personally affected by the pandemic or personally know someone who has been? To answer this, I used Qualtrics to survey over 1,000 respondents from across the country. Respondents were placed into 4 ideological groups: strong and weak Republicans and strong and weak Democrats. Respondents also received a proximity score from 0 through 12, which is meant to represent their personal experiences with COVID-19. Quantifying personal experience is a tricky thing. Respondents were asked if they are related to someone who caught or died from COVID-19, know of someone who caught or died from COVID-19, caught COVID themselves, lost a job due to the pandemic, or know someone or are related to someone who lost a job due to the pandemic. Respondents received 1 proximity point for every question they answered yes to, with an additional point being given for experiences affecting respondents themselves and for experiences involving death, since these are more likely to be salient. And as you can see here, a decent sized chunk of respondents reported no negative experiences with COVID-19, though the vast majority were affected to some degree. Additionally, respondents who received a score from 0 through 3 were categorized as low proximity respondents, 4 through 8 as medium, and 9 through 12 as high. To give some more specific examples from the data, over 2/3 of respondents knew someone who got sick, 39% knew someone who had died, and nearly half knew someone who had become unemployed. These depressing figures show the extent to which my respondent pool was personally affected by the pandemic, highlighting the virus's devastating effects on everyday Americans. However, despite the severity and reach of these experiences, I still expected the effects of respondents' partisan identities, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, to overwhelm the effects of increased proximity to COVID-19 when respondents evaluate the president. Accordingly, I expect Republicans to be substantially more favorable towards President Trump's COVID-19 response when compared to Democrats, and for the opposite to be true for President Biden. Importantly, I expect this to hold true even when accounting for proximity scores. So in other words, personal experiences won't really matter for presidential evaluations, but party will. To begin with, let's look at the isolated effects of party ID on evaluations of President Trump's COVID response. You can see a very clear negative relationship. As respondents go from strong Republicans to strong Democrats, there's a consistent decrease in satisfaction levels. Strong Republicans are on average satisfied, strong Democrats not so much. Look now what happens when we look at the effects of party ID on Biden evaluations. The relationship almost perfectly reverses. Republicans say that COVID response will worsen or neither worsen nor improve, whilst Democrats handily believe that Biden will improve the pandemic response. Keeping in mind that clear statistical relationship between party and evaluations, proximity effects are pretty unclear in comparison. To the extent that proximity has an effect on Trump evaluations, which it barely seems to here, increased proximity to negative effects of COVID-19 actually has a slight increasing effect for satisfaction with Trump. In other words, as respondents are hurt more by COVID, they reward Trump more. Proximity's relationship with Biden evaluations is a little more pronounced. Increased proximity has a slight decreasing effect for Biden evaluations, though not even enough to change the average response. This shows how proximity doesn't have a consistent effect across these presidents, nor is that effect even substantial. To justify this claim, I went ahead and combined the two variables. I separated out Democrats and Republicans so we could look at them separately to look for proximity effects. Here we're looking at the Trump variable. As you can see, nearly all of the variation in responses is concentrated among high proximity Democrats. They become more favorable of Trump compared to their lower proximity counterparts. Republicans are pretty much unaffected across all proximity groups. And you see basically the same thing for the Biden variable. High proximity Democrats account for almost all the variability, becoming more unfavorable towards Biden compared to lower proximities, and with some slight movement among high proximity Republicans. However, in the case of both presidents, the overall partisan gap between respondent evaluations is simply massive. Next, I did a thorough multivariate regression analysis for both variables. This means that I controlled for other things like education, race, income, and I found the correlation between party ID in evaluations and proximity in evaluations. In short, the results stayed the same, with party ID effects becoming even stronger. The difference in magnitude of association, which is the statistical effect of an independent variable on the dependent variable, so the gap between party and proximity, is huge. The gap between a strong Republican and a strong Democrat for the Trump variable is nearly 4 times the gap between a zero proximity respondent and a maximum proximity respondent. For the Biden variable, that gap is a little less, but it's still 3 times as powerful as proximity. To put that in perspective, the effect of someone who knows at least one person who got sick, is related to at least one of these people, knows at least one person who has died, is related to at least one person who has died, has caught COVID themselves, knows at least one person who has become unemployed, is related to at least one of these people, and has personally become unemployed. All of those things is still only a third of the effect of party ID in Biden's case, or a fourth in Trump's. Once again revealed by the data, it is partisanship rather than traumatic personal experiences with COVID that overwhelmingly informs respondents' evaluations. And let's not kid ourselves, not all presidents are made equal. Let's look at a comparison between Trump's COVID response and Biden's as of March 2020 when this survey was distributed. Trump oversaw 85% of the pandemic response by this point, as well as 400,000 deaths. His government response was characterized by downplaying the severity of the virus, encouraging unapproved treatments, discouraging the use of face masks, and publicly disagreeing with the advice of leading medical experts. Biden oversaw only 15% of the pandemic response, as well as 150,000 deaths. His government response was basically the exact opposite of Trump's in a lot of meaningful ways. So what are the main takeaways here? As the data suggests, accountability, to the extent that there is any, is decided by recency rather than culpability. Respondents greatly affected by COVID were more forgiving of Trump and less so of Biden, despite the quality of each president's governmental responses not necessarily reflecting this distribution of blame. Compared to party ID, personal experience with COVID-19 doesn't matter much at all. In every single analysis performed, accountability on the basis of respondents' lived experiences was either found to be completely insignificant, statistically weak, or inconsistent. Conversely, partisan identity was repeatedly found to hold intensely strong, consistent correlation with respondents' answers among both dependent variables. While these findings are fantastic for the validity of this study's hypotheses, they do not instill confidence in the health of democratic accountability in America. If the American people don't use their own personal experiences to hold their political leaders responsible for their actions or inaction in the face of the greatest humanitarian disaster and epidemiological threat that this country has faced in recent history, and instead continue to treat politics as some team game between blue and red, then it's safe to say that the bedrock of our democracy, democratic accountability, is facing an existential threat. Thank you.